Sewing terms, sewing vocabulary and techniques that will help you sew high quality projects. First is the right side of the fabric. The right side of the fabric is the pattern side of the fabric that you want to have showing when you're done sewing your project, oftentimes called the pretty side, as compared to the wrong side. The wrong side is the back side or the inside of the project, sometimes called the ugly side. When they print patterns on fabric, they literally use a printer, and it prints really nice on one side, but then the ink gets soaked into the fabric and is very pale on the back side. Whenever you sew, if you want to see the right side on the outside, you're going to sew with the two right sides touching, and we'll turn them right side out later. Back stitching is when you use the sewing machine to stitch 2 or 3 stitches backwards on the same line at the beginning or the end of a seam to secure the stitches. It effectively ties a knot. If you sew in the exact same spot twice, the thread will not be coming out. I like to start about here in my fabric, back stitch the edge, and then come forward all the way down to this edge, and then I back stitch back in. Make sure it's less than 1/2 inch long. Grainline. This is a pattern symbol. This double arrow can be found on pattern pieces, and it explains how that pattern piece should be lined up on the fabric, which direction it should turn, etc. The grain line should always be exactly parallel to the selvage edge of the fabric. Parallel means it never crosses. Notches are another pattern symbol. There are these diamond-shaped symbols on the edge of a pattern that extend past where you would cut the fabric, and they're to help you match up 2 different pieces of pattern, or afterwards the 2 different cut pieces of fabric. For example, the front of your pant leg to match up with the back of your pant leg. Place on fold line is another pattern symbol. It is an arrow that is bent and indicates that this edge of the pattern that the arrow is pointing at must be placed exactly on a folded edge of fabric and never cut along that fold. If you look at the front of your t-shirt, there's not a seam that goes down the front. Their pattern was only half of a shirt, where they put that center on the fold and cut it out with it ending up being one piece across the front of your t-shirt. Seam and seam allowance. The seam is the actual row of stitches created when you sew. The seam allowance is the distance from that row of stitching to the edge of the fabric. If you want to sew a straight line, your seam allowance is going to have to be the same distance, and you'll use the stitch plate on your sewing machine to help you sew evenly. Selvage, the tightly woven edge of fabric that runs lengthwise down the fabric. When you fold your fabric in half before you put pattern pieces on and cut, you're going to make sure those selvages touch. On most printed fabric, the selvage is this lovely white edge with words that you don't want to actually use. It gives you a nice hint at where it is. Sometimes it's just 2 rows of dots down the edge, but if you pull on this edge, it will never fray because it is tightly woven. Slipstitch. Slipstitch is a hand stitch that's almost invisible on both the right and the wrong side of your sewing project because of how it's sewn. Basically, you have 2 folds of fabric here, and you're stitching back and forth so that as soon as you come out of this fold, you jump straight into that fold, and then you travel along the fold before you jump straight across. If you're jumping straight across, those 2 holes that you made with the needle will match up, and when the thread's pulled tight, it will disappear between the 2 folds of the fabric. Regulation stitch length. The optimum length each of your stitches should be is 2.5 millimeters. On your sewing machine, 2.5 shows up on the right side and you can see it easy. If you make your stitch length longer, it's easier to seam rip. If you make it smaller, it becomes near impossible to seam rip. This is the optimum length for secure stitches that are easy to undo if you make a mistake. The most common seam allowance, distance from the row stitching to the edge of your fabric, is 5/8 of an inch. 5/8 is what you should sew at unless told otherwise by your pattern instructions. Pivoting is a way to turn a sharp corner when stitching. Basically, it's like in basketball when you pivot. You plant one of your feet and then you can spin back and forth all you'd like. To do it in sewing, you first turn the handle so the needle is down in the fabric, you plant the needle, then you can lift up your presser foot and then turn your fabric to where you need it to be, and then don't forget to lower your presser foot again, and then you can continue sewing on your merry little way. A casing is the folded over and sewn edge of fabric that is created a tube for elastic or drawstring to be fed through. Be careful to make sure these edges will not fray or fall apart. You can serge them or fold them a second time before you sew them down. And then you can slide your elastic or drawstring through the casing. Most hoodies around the hood have a string that you can pull tight. That is a casing. Hem is the folded over and sewn edge of clothes to keep them from fraying. For example, it's the bottom of shirts, pants, sleeves, etc. You fold it twice and you sew across to keep it from falling apart. Ironing is a side-to-side motion involving heat, moisture, and pressure with the iron to smooth out wrinkles. Just back and forth just to get rid of wrinkles. Pressing is an up and down motion using heat, moisture, and pressure with the iron to purposefully crease fabric. It's best to push down firmly for about 10 seconds before you lift the iron up, move it over to your next session, and press down without sliding across the fabric. This will help you get nice folds for hems. Pressing seams open. When you sew, you connect two pieces of fabric. When you press the seams open, you're separating your seam allowance layers so you can iron them flat. If this was sewn at 5/8 of an inch, my row stitching would be right here in the center, and I have now pushed open both edges of the seam allowance, that 5/8 inch amount of fabric, so I can press it open. Raw edge, the edge of fabric that will fray and fall apart. These edges that will fall apart. Most cut edges of fabric will fray and fall apart unless you do something about it. A seam finish is a sewing technique that will prevent the raw edge from fraying. You usually only sew one layer of fabric when you create a seam finish. Options include zigzagging or serging, and there are at least 10 others. You take the edge of your seam allowance and you just zigzag right up there on the edge, only going through that single layer of the seam allowance, and then you do it with the other side. Same goes for your serging. Just be careful you're only going through one layer instead of through the middle of your project. Notions. Notions are any item needed to sew a project other than fabric and thread. For example, buttons, elastic, cording, zippers, etc. Any of these extra items you need to complete your final project. These sewing equipment and vocabulary term pieces will help you be able to sew quality projects.